What's going on, everyone? It's Ozzy from OzTalksHW, and this is going to be an interesting video yet again because I haven't done anything like this before. We have one specific goal for this video, and that is to get Ryzen to 4.6 GHz, at least on a single core, and try and push it as far as we can go on a 240mm AIO water cooler. You might be asking, Ozzy, but why? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are three big inspirations for this video, three of them. Ryzen's XFR and Precision Boost 2 work really well. With some proper cooling and some overclocking tweaks, you can get high-end clocks on even their 6 and 8 core variants. And if you don't know what their Precision Boost 2 and XFR 2 is, I'll briefly explain that later. The Deepcool Castle 240 that Deepcool supplied for this video is a solid performer for the price, and it looks pretty good too, so I wanted to kind of push it to its limits. And lastly, reviewing a water cooling unit is frankly boring, and I didn't just want to review the Castle 240. Instead, I wanted to try something a little bit different and more exciting, and this was definitely both of those. Now, before we go over the overclocking results and we check and see if I was able to push the Ryzen 5 to 4.6 GHz, let's take a look at the AIO that we have in store. The Deepcool Castle 240 RGB supports all modern AMD sockets, including the AM4 and the Threadripper sockets, and all modern Intel sockets, including LGA20, LGA1366, and LGA115 sockets. As long as your PC can house the radiator, then this cooler will work just fine. The box itself includes the cooler itself, which has braided tubes that bend really well, a 240mm radiator, a freakishly tall CPU block and pump standing at 2.8 inches or 71mm from the bottom of its copper plate. Keep in mind that this could be a limiting factor in some small form factor builds. The block pump combo uses a 5V RGB header cable for its lighting at the very front. It also includes two 120mm fans rated at 1800 revolutions per minute. They have rubber mats around the screw holes to decrease rattling and noise, and a 5V addressable RGB header cable for lighting. Lastly, it comes with the mounting gear, RGB header to SATA adapters in case your motherboard does not have any 5V adder connectors, and a fan hub, all of which is very clearly labeled. Oh, and a manual, you can't forget that. The Castle 240 RGB retails for $109 US and 109 British pounds. The test bench that we have today includes the Ryzen 5 2600X, an Asus Crosshair 7 X470 AM4 motherboard, a 120GB inland SSD with Windows 10 64-bit Pro, an RX 480 reference, and 2x4 gigs of G-Skill memory at 2133 MHz with timings at 15, 15, 15, and 38 at stock. Despite being an overclocking monster, the Asus Crosshair 7 has AuraSync technology, which proves to be a lovely asset on the motherboard. Since Deepcool doesn't have any RGB software on their own, the motherboard software or the provided remote control can take control of the lighting. You can make some beautiful color combinations using AuraSync on the Castle 240, and if you want to, even sync it to music, which is actually a pretty big deal for me since I really like music. I tested the 2600X at several different clock speeds, and I ran the fans included in the AIO at their stock or standard curve and also at full blast. I did a 5-minute 8064 stress test for some very basic stability, and during this test I grabbed the peak and the average temperatures. Now keep in mind that if I wanted to ensure full stability of the system, I would do hours of stress testing, but for the sake of the video, 5 minutes was okay. After the stress test, I ran Cinebench multi-threaded and single-threaded benchmarks. My ambient room temperature is about 22 degrees Celsius, so without any further ado, here are the results. The Castle 240 did very well in all of the stress tests. Even at the highest overclock, the 2600X peaked at 77 degrees Celsius and averaged under 70 degrees during the AIO-64 run. The stock fan curve is also more than enough for adequately cooling the overclocked Ryzen chip. Not much is gained by running the fans at full blast 24/7 since the stock fan curve does that automatically once the chip hits the 70 degrees threshold. My Cinebench scores scaled well with each respective clock. I didn't break 1400 in the multi-threaded benchmark and maxed at 176 in the single-threaded benchmark. These numbers seemed a bit low, so I did a single test with overclocked RAM to see if that really did play a part, and what do you know, it definitely did. With RAM at 2933 at 18, 18, 18, 38 timings, my 107 base clock overclock hit 181 in the single-threaded benchmark and 1424. And I'm unofficially the 19th best 2600X in the world according to HWBot. Not to brag or anything. I browsed the other scores of the 2600Xs on HWBot and felt like mine was underperforming even after a heavy overclock. With a base clock of 107, I only hit 1424, while other chips were breaking 1500 points at a similar clock. I looked into the performance enhancer option in my Asus BIOS, which seemed to be the culprit. I had it set to auto on all of the tests, and the motherboard more than likely set it to the lowest level to ensure stability. Performance Enhancer allows for higher sustained clock speeds by sustaining the peak voltage longer for XFR and Precision Boost to do their thing. Level 3 and Level 4 help sustain high overclocks, but also need a lot of voltage. I tried Level 2 on the 2600X at stock and with RAM at 2933 at the 18, 18, 18, 38 timings, and it performed very closely to my 107 base clock overclock, a 6 and 4% increase over the single and multi-threaded scores respectively over my very first 2600X test at stock. I did a similar test with the 2600X at Enhancer Level 2 and a base clock of 103, and I got 185 single and 1450 multi. Much better than my previous clocks, and the entire time the CPU stayed under 80 degrees Celsius using the Captain 240. Now, to answer the question in the title, did I get the Ryzen 5 to boost up to 4.6 GHz on an AIO cooler? Now, I was able to get it to get up to 4,586 megahertz. If you want to count that as 4.6, then be my guest. But unfortunately, with the 108 base clock that it had, it was not stable at all. There was also a positive 300 millivolt core voltage offset, which at that point, it's not sustainable at all for Ryzen, and I was hitting 1.6, 1.7 volts regularly. I did not feel safe running it at that kind of V-core, and so I would say this is a failure in that regard. But I do think there are some successes in other regards. For one, the Deepcool Captain 240 did really well. It kept the thermals low even on a heavily overclocked Ryzen 5 2600X, and it looks aesthetically pleasing and is semi-affordable. So if you're in the market for that, then it gets my recommendation just on the week that I had it here for testing. Another success is the idea that I learned a lot more about overclocking. Now, I have overclocked CPUs before, but I've never really pushed for a max overclock. It was more for something sustainable. I would, overclock it a little bit, and then I would do a test for an hour or two, and I was semi-conservative most of the time, but this time I really went all the way in. Today I learned, or this week I learned more about Asus's performance enhancement, or their TPU, and how if you want the best overclock for a Ryzen chip, you really should stay in the level 2 to level 3 area and have your base clock around 102 to 104 max. If you guys want to know my BIOS settings, then I will leave them in the description below. And if you have any tips for me for overclocking and getting better performance, then also let me know too. I'm not a rookie at this, but there's obviously room for improvement. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, make sure you leave a like. And if you loved it, share and subscribe, because I will have a ton of videos like this coming out in the near future. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you guys later.